ICAMT, the International Committee of Architecture and Museums Techniques, decided to gather short but significant stories about design of nowadays museum. In a time of uncertainties marked by the pandemic and by transition towards sustainability, digitalization and wars. The stories of architects, designers, museum experts and directors mark the transition of museum institutions which have chosen to become leaders of the changes of our time for democratization, inclusivity and accessibility to visual and material culture. Podcast goal is to reach this event with themes, examples and solutions that might become better daily approaches. Welcome to the ICAMT podcast series. I am Maddalena D'Alfonso of the board of ICAMT, the International Committee for Architecture and Museum Techniques of ICOM, the International Council of Museums. Hello to everybody. We are here with architect Timothy Ventimiglia. Thank you for being with us on our ICAMT podcast team.
It's my pleasure to join you, Madeleine.
Tim Ventimiglia's 30 years career as a designer encompasses interpretive planning, architectural and exhibition design for museums, visitor centers, monuments, memorials, parks, and corporate experience centers. For the last 12 years, Tim is director of Ralph Appelbaum Associates Berlin, Germany-based studio and leads RAS European Commissions, including the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, the World Museum in Vienna, and the Museum of the Viking Age in Oslo. He has held various teaching positions at Cornell University, Pratt Institute, and Parsons Schools of Design, where he created the Museum Design Lab, a graduate seminar on museum history and design, which he taught at the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum in New York City. Your professional activity is filled with projects of great importance. Which of your works do you find most representative of your approach to planning and design?
Well, it's an interesting question after 30 years in this profession. Interestingly, it's not in a prominent European or American city. The project that really changed my view of what a museum is and can be is located in Alaska. Starting about 20 years ago in 2003, I worked over 7 years on a new wing of the Anchorage Museum called the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center. And the architect for this new wing was David Chipperfield. The new Arctic Center's mission was to exhibit hundreds of original historic artifacts returned to Alaska from the Smithsonian Central Collections in Maryland, near Washington, D.C. And they would, on their return, be interpreted by Alaskan Native communities' own scholars, teachers, and elders. And prior to this new center, to the opening, they had to all travel from Alaska to Washington, which was an arduous process, and one could argue a kind of social injustice. So the project, in its essence, was a kind of repatriation or homecoming of sorts for the Alaskan Native communities. And so it's through this kind of community engagement that was happening for decades in the research as a dialogue finally would have a representative space and a proper fit out and accessibility for not just displaying object, but also for making the consultation process transparent to the public. And so my design was to create a nonlinear exhibit, and that a place where the knowledge gained through dialogue with communities is constantly growing and reintegrated into the content management systems and media interfaces that we created. And so every object is accompanied by a wealth of growing information and interpretation. So the objects themselves were in fact also chosen by the communities to tell the stories that they wanted to tell. And the way that they were displayed was also informed by the advisement of communities. Literally, how is an object mounted in the showcase should reveal something about its meaning and its historic use. So I guess in this project, I came to appreciate other cultural and historic perspectives, how to incorporate community engagement in a design process. And I learned a lot about the relevance of a museum and how design can support a museum's public engagement that I had not yet seen in other projects. Well, if only more people could, make the trip to Alaska. But in some ways, this prepared me for the big assignment I took on in Europe, in Berlin, in the years to follow.
Very nice and interesting. Located in the reconstructed Berlin Palace on Berlin's Museums Island, the newly opened Humboldt Forum is envisioned as an international forum of art, culture, and science. Can you describe your project?
Well, regarding the Humboldt Forum, for me and our team, this was a massive logistical undertaking. Some people say a mammoth undertaking. To start with, I had to move to Germany with my family from New York and create a whole office. And simply finding the qualified staff was a huge effort. And of course, all in a new language. We had, in the end, about 46 people working over 10 years who viewed and drew about 20,000 artifacts and discussed each one of them many times over with museum colleagues. So I would say that the challenges of the project were not as many would presume due to scale, but were actually rather kind of organizational and logistic. During the planning, the leadership of the Humboldt Forum changed many times. Curators retired, directors of museums even retired, and new people were appointed, with new ideas. And yeah, that was the second great challenge, how to retain some sense of order and continuity. And everyone knows about the reconstructed Berlin Palace. It was never really meant to be an edifice. Its mission as a forum, like the Arctic Studies Center, which I just mentioned before, is really meant to be a dynamic place full of change, a place where there are museums within museums, temporary exhibitions within more permanent exhibitions, activity rooms, performances and artist installations, study collections areas, and immersive media and soundscapes. And many objects, however, despite this goal of ultimate flexibility, many objects for technical or conservation reasons required a more permanent integration. And so the architectural planning was quite advanced, and there wasn't a lot of room for change and adaptation. That created a real challenge. And also maybe the predefined form of the building with long chains of rooms prescribed a kind of pathway and created an inevitable impediment to flexibility. But I think there's some truly remarkable installations at the Humboldt Forum, and it was also just great working with such a fantastic collection and with artists and other designers in the making of the project. In the end, the forum opened. It had 3 different openings, and in fact, now that we're done, it's a very dynamic and highly relevant new institution. Many talk about the injustices inherent in the forum's collections, the processes of decolonization, social justice, and legal restitution. And even if everything was not easy and without friction, I truly believe the forum gives these processes a much needed space for the much needed social discourse, which in the end leads to political decision making to right social injustices. So working on this project is really almost like, with all these topics, it's really almost like being here for the second fall of the Berlin Wall. I somehow describe it as an event that ended an era and started a new era. I really believe that the forum brought these much needed changes to reality and serves as a model for many other national institutions to do the same.
Thank you. What is your approach towards incorporating digital and multimedia content into exhibition design?
That's an interesting question, because I think many think somehow or fear that ultimately media will supplant the importance of authentic physical collections. And I strongly disagree with this. But I also don't think that objects alone can tell every story. So in my approach, it's important to have the story clear first and then seek the collections or other media that's needed to tell the story. It's often a challenge when a museum holds millions of objects and their primary duty is to keep them protected. They can't do that. They shouldn't be exhibiting anything. So there's a tendency among these institutions to simply make long lists of objects and then define a narrative around them. But, we also collect immaterial heritage like sound and film and photo archives. And these are very important records of human history. Sometimes we have to ask museums to show us those assets as well because they're overlooked. In the end, I think media can enhance the appreciation of objects and play a supporting role. For instance, curators and researchers collect data around objects. When we talk to them about their research, they show us scans and photographs that can enhance an object's visibility and add context and interpretation. So if this is already done between researching institutions who are sharing this information about the objects they are researching, why not also make that information accessible and bring it into play with regard to the museum's storytelling for the public? So it's also kind of an interesting development, I guess, in my decades practice is that the boundaries between graphics and media are blurring more and more. Even among our own staff, we don't have graphic designers and media designers the way we used to, but now we have visual designers.
Very interesting, these changes that you are pointing to us. It's quite interesting to see these movements inside the professionals' activities. In the Humboldt Forum is also available a 3D sound experience. Do you think it's important for museum to offer visitors an atmosphere as immersive as possible?
Well, that connects very well with the topic we just discussed. When I came to Berlin about 11 years ago, we had a few months of simply immersing ourselves in the ethnography and art collections of the Staatliche Museum. And among those visits, there was a visit to the ethnomusicology archive where we discovered a truly wonderful collection of musical instruments from all around the world. But also, less visible were 400,000 sound recordings that they had collected as a research institute. And some of these sound recordings went back to the 19th century. And I have a lot of friends who are involved in music and creating sound as their art. And I talked with a few of them about this, and it turns out many of them knew about this collection. It's a very important collection, but the larger public seemed to be unaware of the ethnomusicology collection. So I saw it in the context of Berlin as a city of sound, really a place of music and composition, past, present, and future, right up to DJs and clubs and everything else, avant-garde. So we decided we needed a prominent place in the exhibit, not for objects, but for sound as a material culture, and also to allow for a ever-changing sound program, which would be befitting to the city of sound. Initially, we planned a central 3D sound space, and I think we had many smaller sound satellites embedded within different exhibitions. And those have manifest themselves in various ways, but the central space really became, I think, an icon of the overall forum's public offering. This elliptical listening room, which is just beautifully centrally located under the cupola. It was actually a collaboration with Berlin's Technical University, who had already engineered what's called a wave field synthesizer. In German, it's Wellenfeldsynthese. It's basically a super high-end sound playback system that can locate specific sound channels in 3D space. If you imagine you're a musician playing an instrument in a symphony orchestra, you can literally hear the other players sitting to the left of you and to the right of you in three-dimensional space. So with this, we created really the greatest hi-fi experience for recorded sound playback in Berlin, City of Sound. And I think that important to note is that in sense of flexibility, the forum uses the archive materials, even though they're historic, for contemporary compositions, and invites composers and artists from different cultures to create new audio experiences. And for me, even if it was technically challenging, this was definitely one of the most innovative and rewarding parts of the project.
How nice. It's look that collection finally is also a way to manage the future composition and to make new pieces of art and generate researches. So it gets a lot in the new ideas of our institution.
Well, it's in the spirit of participation and engagement with the public to not just offer things to look at, but to actually work with the material. I believe collections, in the sense of a democratic process of understanding our heritage, should really be worked with, not just by researchers, but somehow. And with immaterial assets like sound archive, you can do that obviously easier than challenging objects with conservation, restrictions. So that was really very exciting kind of aspect of working with that particular collection.
I can imagine. It fits perfectly in the new definition of Museum of ICOM that we just votes in the last General Assembly. How does your work relate to the new, now so important topics of sustainability and accessibility?
Well, I think these are two very central topics, especially maybe over the last 10 years. If I look at my sort of 30-year career so far, it's these last 10 years, those have become a real focus of discussion. So I guess I would go step back maybe a little bit in my project history to a project I did in Utah. There was a whole natural history museum for the University of Utah overlooking Salt Lake City. It opened in 2011. And this is, of course, a very different landscape. It's not a museum in a big urban center, but one surrounded, by mountains and in the high desert. They aimed for the highest standard of sustainability at the time as a museum, new building construction, and achieved a LEED Gold status. So they set their mission and they met it, and through the whole process. And to do this, and to work with architects and us designers to incorporate a lot of different solutions. But they also, was maybe most notably, they had to reevaluate their conservation standards, as most of a museum's energy is actually consumed by intense climate management systems. And so what can you do about this? Well, I recall initially the goal was to meet a humidity standard set by conservators in Washington, D.C., which I don't know if you know is a very humid environment. And the museum's conservators in Utah questioned the logic of that and said, most of our collections existed in the high, dry deserts of the Rocky Mountains for thousands of years without humidity. So they decided to reduce the humidification to areas where it was really needed. And this dramatically changed the energy footprint of the museum's operations, and of course their cost as well, operating costs. So I guess with that as an example, it's not necessarily an exhibition example, but it affected certainly how we design the exhibitions. Maybe it's worth looking at specific local environmental situations when thinking about your energy and climate solutions. And I can tell you now, 15 years later, the museum has increased its ambition and is rethinking its operations and wants to become a net zero operation, and is developing a long-term strategic plan to meet that goal. So that's sustainability. I think inclusion is really another whole area, or accessibility and inclusion. And I'd say this has definitely changed the way we change exhibitions, design exhibitions, and there have really always been legal requirements for accessibility, and of course everybody's obligated to these. But more and more museums are opting to go beyond these and incorporate specific enhanced measures with people with various disabilities, physical, cognitive, etc. And I think this is a really important development for our supporting our democratic values, which have inclusion at its core and accessibility. So I do, however, see a danger of creating special measures which fulfill specific audience groups' needs, but then segregate them and even exclude others. We've seen this in projects where if you approach it like a checklist, you might end up with several exhibitions rather than one for everybody. And therefore, we set as a goal a principle of design for all, where we evaluate every uh, aspect in terms of multisensoric um, accessibility, and that anything we design should really provide enrichment for all visitors and not just segregated groups, because I think it's counter to the mission. So if I can just say a kind of a advice at the end, my experience is that it's always essential to discuss these topics very early, sustainability and accessibility, and set the goals with the clients. Otherwise, the exhibition, the building even, will suffer, and it's really, really hard to retrofit solutions that are accepted by all.
Thank you, Tim. You have created a graduate minor about museum curation at the Parsons School of Design. How important is the theoretical training in these fields, in your opinion?
Yes, that was some time ago. I was a professor for many, many years in New York for the Parsons School of Design. My class was taught, it was a graduate level seminar, it was at the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum. Just quite an honor to leave the workday with Applebaum Associates for just a few hours every week and talk to students. It was really rewarding for me to work with them because they're a different kind of clientele. Of course, young people have a lot of energy and they need a place to focus it. They have a lot of questions and general curiosity. And museums are full of complex topics. And though many might think of a museum as a kind of eternal space, a monument that's never changing, they're actually quite modern inventions. Museums are a product of 19th century, and they're also constantly adapting. They have to adapt to survive and stay relevant. So I think it's really every designer's responsibility to understand the history of design and the issues that are central to, if you're working with museums, central to a museum's public engagement. And how does design support that? Only then can you really imagine a change. And I guess I would add, I kind of think of myself as an eternal student. I say often that my career choice, I studied architecture and have 2 degrees in architecture and urban design. But I left that 30 years ago for exhibition design and museum planning in order to maintain my status as eternal student. Many projects, different subjects, people, places. This is what motivates me every day, and what attracted me to the particular field. I think confronting new ideas and knowledge and adapting to new perspectives, it keeps me humble and energized.
I agree with this perspective. I completely agree. In your career, you have worked with numerous historical museums. In this particular context, does the design process change? If so, in which way? What strategies do you use to make the content as contemporary as possible?
Good question. A lot has changed, and maybe it's sometimes we don't take the time it's required to reflect on that change. But when I started as an architect, I think most people assume the job is about designing a spectacular form, an object. And an architect had a kind of atmosphere of stardom. And of course, this still exists, but I think many designers see themselves more as facilitators of process. Developing a project with a museum is not a solitary act of creation, but it's really an act of social engagement. Processes are driven by dialogue, and really there are enormous number of contributors, and sometimes seemingly endless inputs. So I think part of the job as a designer is simply to manage and channel all of that. I think many historic museums are looking to update and correct past wrongs, but also maybe be more nimble in how they address contemporary issues. if I think about it in the span of my own 30-year career, we've come out of a period of what I was born into was a period of relative stability. Of course, we had the Cold War as a kind of constant threat. But, it's already in the 80s, 70s, we witnessed economic crashes and slowly devastating environmental changes. You're just looking at the pictures of New York from the wildfires this morning. Unbelievable. Looks like a film, a horror film. We have renewed fights for social and environmental justice. We somehow thought that was all well underway, but still much work needed. And global pandemics, like war, can you believe it, right here in Europe? And now new topics we couldn't have imagined, like artificial intelligence and deep fakes and relative truths in the media. Really unbelievable how much has happened in these last decades. And when I was young, I never really could have imagined all this. But the fact is that many of these topics have long histories. They're not new. They have a basis in our human behavior in history. And to understand them, I think we need places to come together and discuss and explore our histories. So a museum of history, even if it's mostly about the past, must be able to keep its visitors accessing and navigating these contemporary topics as well, in order for them to be appreciated and understood as relevant to society. They need to remain authoritative lenses of history and science. I think our survival as a society even depends on this, as well as education. So sometimes we need to give more space, not just to exhibit and tell in a didactic way, but also to reflect and debate, for people to participate and share ideas with others in a safe, socially engaging physical space away from, the couch and your internet connection. And, museums are places essentially to bring people together to do that.
Nice, thank you. Your next project will be the Museum of the Viking Age in Oslo. What do you have in mind? What will be the key design step?
Well, this is really an amazing project. Our work with the University of Oslo is in the middle of a creative process. We have curators, conservators, architects, engineers, and even a curious and engaged public contributing to the project through workshops and focus groups. In fact, we just finished a round of focus groups to evaluate our concepts. We're in the first phase, just finished the first phase. And what's clear is that through generations, not just in Norway, but everywhere in the world, we've sought to understand the Viking Age, and there are many preconceptions and maybe misuses of the history from Wagner to Netflix. And this museum aims to be the official record and set that record straight, because it's based on research and collections, and they are the vanguard of information on the Viking Age. And for me, the collection and the attention to its preservation and the amount of effort put in there is truly inspiring, especially these magnificent Viking ships, which, for me, it's like working with such objects is a huge honor and a responsibility. But I was reflecting in recent meetings about how the objects, these ships, and the people who made them and used them, it's kind of like having clients who've traveled to us from another time, and we're sort of taking care of them in this new museum. We're talking about 300 years of Viking culture, which is a relatively short period of time for the impact Viking culture has made in the world. And this is all from 1,000 years ago, so there's little to no written record. The objects can't speak, or the Vikings can't speak, and everything we know is through archaeologic evidence and its scientific interpretation. So I would not, however, say this will be an old dusty archaeology museum of your grandparents' era, but really a lively place of storytelling and immersion. We're using a lot of media collaboratively with a media firm, Tamczyk Media and Space, here in Berlin, as creative partners. But all of the media that they create is actually generated out of scientific data. So not created from some artistic vision, but really based in hard data. And what really astounds me today as we learn more about the Viking Age is that names like Dublin, is really a Viking name. Dublin means dark harbor in Old Norse. It was founded by Vikings. Even the names of the week, like Wednesday is Wotanstag, which is Odin's day, or Thursday is Thor's day, and Friday is Freya's day. They all come from this age, 300 years, 1,000 years ago. So even if we don't see Vikings walking around, they're still very much with us every day. Fascinating.
Amazing. I didn't know about the weekdays. In Oslo, you rely on the services of Gopion Technologies. How will the collaborative project be arranged?
Well, yes, Gopion is one of many partners on the project, and I guess I want to be careful not to advocate for one company, and they are not the only player in town, but Gopion is truly great company specializing in custom showcases. If you could name the 100 most important objects to humanity, and if they were displayed in a museum, probably a majority of them are in a showcase built by Gopion. But so maybe enough sales talk. I think more importantly is that one unique aspect of the Norwegian client's procurement strategy is that they simultaneously contracted REA and TMS as the designers and Gopion and other firms as the builder providers, rather than following a design bid build process. They contracted everything simultaneously. And this allows for collaboration during the design, which in my mind is very, very beneficial to the end product and the budget. The underlying concept is a special procurement process based on guaranteed price. So in the US, we call it a GMP project, a guaranteed maximal price. And it means the budget is known to all bidders. In other words, you don't bid out to find the lowest bidder, but rather to see how bidders respond to a given budget. And they commit to fulfilling the project for that budget. And I try to encourage any museum's client to follow this procedure because it really results in a more efficient use of time and resources, and also establishes a working atmosphere of partnership and collaboration. Of course, it's not always possible. In private museums, of course, they have that option. In the US, it's maybe more and more possible to follow a GMP procurement, but in most European public institutions, normally have to follow the design bid build process. And then you hope to end up with a great fabricator producer at the end of your design efforts. Design to a guaranteed price, where the builder is involved in the design process, really allows us all to collaborate and steer the design. And we're doing this with Gopion already. We have meetings in Berlin with them, in Milano, where they are located, and also, of course, in Oslo with the museum team and architects. And we're all bringing together our different expertise. We as designers specialize in how the showcases look and fit within the overall architecture and scenography, and of course, how objects are mounted and presented to tell stories. And Gopion, in this case, brings enormous technical know-how and even their own patented solutions, which have been proven and refined over decades. So the project benefits from the early incorporation of that know-how and that technology. And we have cases that are 3 stories high, containing 1,000 swords in one showcase, and other cases small and containing a single coin. So a huge range of showcases. And even though every case is unique, the underlying technical components are quite uniform. I guess I'll just say one last thing for our podcast. I think that if I had an overarching message, what I've learned is that, we're really enjoying this unique setup which our client has made possible. It wasn't our choice or Gopion's choice. I'd like to say that in the end, much of the success of a project depends on such things, not just with the prowess of a designer and how creative he or she is, but also all these other factors, strategic approaches, including courageous and organized clients having a shared vision for working together. And that's definitely the case in our project with the University of Oslo in Norway.
Thank you very much, Tim, for being today with us. And I hope you enjoy to be part of our podcast season. And thank you also for all our listeners. Goodbye. Thank you for listening. See you soon in the next ICAMT podcast episode.